So now, from AI to narratives and to storytelling, one of the most important tools we have in our arsenal as communicators. Next on stage, we've got Frank Wolf, who is co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer from Staffbase, our platinum partner for today. So thank you, Frank, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Before I say anything else, I want to ask you a question and get an idea of where you are with narrative. My question is, narratives and stories, what do you think? Are they about the same thing, roughly the same thing, or are they different things? And I would ask for a show of hands. Who thinks they're about the same thing, narratives and stories? Who thinks that? Okay, not so many. Cool. So who thinks it's different? Okay. We'll talk about this. Second question, I said here, narratives are tools of manipulation, maybe, or the future of communication. Who thinks narratives are a tool of manipulation? Please. Not too many. Mark, yes. Who thinks it's the future of communication? Oh, wow. So this is my challenge. What I want to do in the next 30 minutes is convince you that this is the future of communication. I said in a talk a couple of weeks ago, I actually think it's more important than AI for comms. And I want to make my case why I think that's like this. So when we start, I would like to start with why I think it matters. And a couple of weeks ago, Joanna Parsons, she's a LinkedIn top voice for internal communication. She made this post, ruin an internal communicator's day in one sentence. It became one of the most highly commented of her posts on LinkedIn, with now way over 500 comments. Anyone in the room has seen it? Okay, yeah. So I brought you three answers. I could have brought more, as you know. So Martin said, could you just pretty this up for me? That's actually the answer that got the most likes on all of this. Can you relate? Anyone can relate here? I guess so, yes. Emma said, no, it has to go to everyone. It's the old thing about protecting your audience from all the stakeholders who always want to send it to everyone, yes. And Trista's saying, can we have a big, sexy campaign to all employees about this new tool policy, right? So there seems to be quite a lot of frustration of communicators with their stakeholders, right? And the expectations of stakeholders and how stakeholders think communications works. And you could ask, like, what's the common thread of all of this, right? And I do not think the common thread is not that your stakeholders and bosses get up in the morning and the first thing they think about is, how can I ruin your day? Anyone here who thinks that this is the case? I hope not. I hope not. If yes, run, right? I think it's something else. And I think it's about an insight that people who are not very good at communication, who are not trained communicators, who are not skilled communicators, they don't understand a very fundamental fact about communication. And this fact is, it's not what you say, it's what people hear, right? You can say your message, you can tell your story, but there's a big gap between what you're saying and what is actually resonating in the mind of your audience, how you are able to change their mind. And at the core, in your job description, communication should change hearts and minds. That's what it's all about. You tell stories, and stories are a means to an end, but they are not the end. The end is you have to change hearts and minds, and this is what it's all about. And in many cases, people who are not good at communication, they don't really understand and appreciate this fact. And this is where we enter a special place, the place of narratives, because if we want to understand what is going on in the minds of our audience, how we can find a better language to talk about this, and to kind of understand how do we have to build our messages, tell our stories to resonate. This is where we enter the land of narratives. And we started to hear about narratives in a lot of talks with our customers when we ask, like, why are you running this campaign? Why are you rolling out this tool? And they usually said things like, we would like to change a narrative. We have a transformation going on. And we understand a big part of this is that we change the narrative of why we do this and how we do this. Or they said things like, we need a new narrative. And when you actually start to research about this, you find there's a ton of things out there about storytelling, but there's not a lot of things out there about narratives. And I started to research this even more and looked at all what's out there in terms of case studies, best practices, also what scientists were doing about narratives. And I started to compile all of this and finally said, it's actually a book. So I've written in the last year a book about narratives. It came out, was launched a couple of weeks ago. It's available on Amazon. If you think it's interesting after the talk, you can consider to go for the book. But what I want to do today is give you a few core ideas of the book and a few core concepts, what narratives are all about. And I want to do this in 3 steps. 1, what is a narrative and why is it more powerful than a story? And you already see here, it's different than a story. Second, a very important concept when we talk about narratives is how can narratives and messages resonate with an audience? And this is all something about to do with the narrative map of your audience. So how can we map this map actually out and how can we describe it? And the third thing is I brought 3 quick ideas how this can change your job, your work, and maybe also convince you that it's the future of communication. When we start with the first one, and defining narratives, if you look up narrative definition, there are a lot of them out there. I find a lot of them very confusing. The one that I personally liked most is that narratives are patterns that emerge from stories. This is a first hint, but let's go in a concrete example to show you what I mean with that. And I love the Barbie example for this, because the first time when I heard about the Barbie movie was coming out, I was very sure that I would not go. I've seen a trailer. I go to about 4 to 5 movies every year, and I don't want to make a mistake. So I read a lot before. I ask a lot of people before I eventually decide to go. I'm very sure I would never go. Then something happened. A online news portal where I read a lot about movies, the guy actually went there and he was surprised. And he said, it's a great plot, it's really funny, it's an amazing story. So he was surprised. And with him, I was surprised too. The second thing, friends went there and watched the movie. My daughter went there. She's in her teenage years. So it wasn't surprised that she liked it, but she really liked it a lot. And she said, like, Dad, it's entirely different than I thought it's going to be. So it's again, was this, there's something else, right? And then a third thing, the movie started to be really successful at the box office. It's now crossing about $1.5 billion. And this is usually a sign people like it, tell their friends, friends go as well. So there's a movement around the movie that's going on, right? So all of these are stories, right? And I hear those stories over time, and they sort of created something in my mind, a pattern. And this pattern is something we can call a narrative. And the narrative that I got from all these stories is the Barbie movie isn't what you think it is, and it might be worth watching. And what we can already see with this example here, narratives are not stories, but they kind of get the structure of a story. So they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The beginning is you think about going to the movie, the middle is you actually go there and watch it, and the end is you are surprised, right? And you think, wow, that was interesting. And the second thing that's sort of related, but to some degree different, stories have a real end, so it doesn't change. The end of a narrative can change over time because new stories can appear. Did anyone hear that there's a new movie planned based on this? It's about Monopoly, right? They want to do a Monopoly movie. So in 5 years, we might stand here and say, Barbie was the beginning of an awful lot of series of toy movies, right? So it might not be cool anymore. That's the cool thing about narratives. They can evolve, right, with new things that are happening. So now that we know that, we can look a bit deeper into the differences and why I say narratives are more powerful. Stories grab your attention, right? So I see this guy reviewing the movie, he tells his story and it grabs my attention. I get the emotion, my daughter comes back from the cinema and she's really like all out excited about it. I have the credibility from stories, like the box office numbers, 1.5 billion. That's there, that's proof that this movie is successful. And I have the diversity of stories because different stories from different actors, different people experience different things. But if they all come together, that's really powerful. Now look at the narrative side. The big thing about narratives is they are inclusive. Inclusive means they are about me. My daughter can be an amazing storyteller. She can tell how she went there and she was surprised. But it's her story, it's not my story. And narrative is about me because I can think, will I go to the movie eventually myself? Will I join the movement? And you can see any good or bad movement in the history of humankind was always a narrative because it's so much more powerful because we can join it. Narratives are how we share our point of view, right? If somebody asks you, how do you like Paris? The first thing you will say is, maybe you've been there, maybe not. The first thing you will say is a narrative. You may say, hey, I think it's really nice. Maybe we should go without the kids or something like this, right? Then you might add a story. Or somebody asks me or somebody else, like, how did you like the movie? You will usually first talk about the narrative. And this is how we pass on our experiences. Narratives create a framing and a confirmation bias. Once I have an opinion about something, I start to be selective about the stories that I listen to because I want them to confirm my narrative. And I get a confirmation bias. So I more and more watch out for stories. And I started to hear more and more stories about how people like the Barbie movie. And that's why it's so hard. If somebody has started to create a narrative in their mind, it's so hard to change it because they have this confirmation bias. They grow obviously stronger with every story. So once you have a narrative, it's really hard to sort of say, let's tell one very emotional story and kind of disrupt the narrative. That's going to be really hard. If you've built a narrative over time, it's got a lot of staying power. And very important, and we hear this morning about business impact and measurement of comms. The very interesting thing about stories is you can measure how many people have seen my news, how many people were engaged and react. But if you really want to measure the outcome of comms, you want to measure the impact, narratives are great because you can ask for them. It's after all, it's in people's mind. You can ask them the question, how likely, for instance, are you to go to the Barbie movie? And I can say from not very likely to highly likely. And you can do this with any narrative you have in your company, inside or outside. You can ask for them. Much more easy than for stories. And last but not least, and I think one of the most important things, narratives are the basis for action. Whenever you actually take action, it's not based on a story or a message you got. It's based on a narrative that was created in your mind. And in this case, I eventually went to the cinema and I watched the movie, right? So that's the action. But that's just one example. If you go and buy a Gucci bag for $2,500, which is a production cost of about $200, you paid more than $2,000 for what? For a narrative, right? If you finally make that trip to Paris because it's been on your bucket list for a very long time, you say, let's wait until the kids are somewhere else at the university and we go to Paris. That's a narrative that's built, that's been created in your mind. But it's the same also inside a company. Employees who decide, I finally need that training. I want to do the career. I sign up to be a team leader. I sign up to do something extraordinary or be an expat and go to another location. That's all narratives because they think about their future self, their aspirational self. And that's a narrative that's been created in their minds. And finally, it's not just about individuals. It's about groups. It's about the company, the industry, the purpose that we have, the vision that we aspire to. That's all narratives that's been built. The people in your company should feel and think the best days of this organization are in front of us. and I want to be a part of this. That's all narratives that you build, right? So I think the first very fundamental insight for me is that as corporate communicators, and I hear this a lot, people are saying, I'm the company's storyteller, I'm the corporate storyteller, I'm the chief storytelling officer. That might all be true, but the core idea and the core task that you have in your companies is you should create, and you're creating narratives. And of course, it's the other way around. Of course, you're telling stories, and I'm sure you're great storytellers, but you tell stories to create narrative. Stories are a means to an end, and the end are narrative creation. At this point, as a trend, and if you look at what does it mean for instance, the tools and the technology that we have, two concrete examples of what we are saying in terms of trend. Narratives need to be way more managed, also in terms of how you measure them. So campaigns get more important. We ask our customers, in how many cases do you use more than one news post for a specific thing that you want to communicate? And we were surprised that in many cases they thought in individual pieces of information and not so much in let's have a campaign and run this over a longer time and shift a narrative over a longer time. So we think campaigns should get really more important for also employee communications. And the other one, measurement. So asking a question about a narrative again and again and again to show how you are shifting with your work, a narrative, I think it's very powerful for communications. So now we have the basics. What's a narrative? What's the difference to a story? And now I want to talk about, I think, a very powerful concept of the narrative map. Because if I tell you the story, the fact that it resonates with you, that you like it or dislike it, really comes down to the narratives in your mind, like how you grew up, the town you live in, your family, your friends, your hobbies. You have thousands of narratives in your mind, and it's really important that what I say resonates with these narratives. And I want to do this with an example of an industry that I find really fascinating. It's space travel, private space travel. There are two companies out there who are kind of leading the pack, both from the US, both founded by, I could say, pretty eccentric billionaires. Blue Origin was founded by Jeff Bezos, Amazon founder, and SpaceX was founded by Elon Musk, founder of Tesla. So those both companies, and we want to talk about their vision statements. And you might say, if you shoot rockets into the sky, it's very easy to have a vision statement, right? Their vision statements are from Blue Origin for the benefit of Earth. And for SpaceX, it's making humanity multiplanetary. So Blue Origin kind of, sort of, as the name also suggests, looks back at Earth as their key purpose. And SpaceX wants to make humanity a spacefaring civilization. If you think for yourself, which of the two do you think is more powerful? Just think about this. If you look at Glassdoor and Glassdoor data, we find that there's quite an interesting difference. The approval of senior management is much higher at SpaceX. The work-life balance is much worse at SpaceX. And the positive business outlook is much higher at SpaceX. So it's a quite interesting setup here where we say, hey, there's a lot of, this seems to be a high energy, fast-paced organization with a really bad work-life balance, but people are engaged. And I'm not saying if it's good or bad, I'm just saying they seem to do something right with how they build their vision and how they talk about their purpose and vision. And if you look technically, SpaceX and Blue Origin were founded about the same year. SpaceX is way ahead in terms of what they have achieved. They've been to orbit. They supplied the International Space Station for many years now. So Blue Origin is really lacking in many ways here. But I don't want to bash anyone of those two companies. Like, it's amazing businesses. I think it's great that we have them. I think it's a great way to learn about this. And we can learn about this by looking at the narrative map. And this came out of the research for the book because I wanted to find a way how can we have a very easy description of a narrative map of our audience? And you can think about this in 2 dimensions. One dimension is, how many people know a narrative? Is this a narrative that just a few people know, or is it a narrative that everyone now knows in the news, right? That's the distribution side. And the other side is a pretty important concept for narratives. How deeply are they embedded? Deeply embedded are narratives which are here for maybe many thousand years, built in our culture, built in things like religion, things in also in culture. If you're here in the UK, you feel there's a specific culture that you have here on the island compared to people in Europe and so on. So that's cultural embeddedness. And what these 2 dimensions create are, for simplification, 4 quadrants. And I call the first one emerging narratives. So these are the narratives most of us know, and they are not deeply culture embedded yet. So that's what you find on the news, the publicly discussed things that are going on. I guess AI would be one of these, and many others as well. If you look to space travel, we could say space travel is just another playground for the rich. There's a lot of criticism going on for that, to say there's just a few hundred individuals on the planet who can actually afford to buy a ticket for a rocket. But a good one is Silicon Valley best practices reinvent space travel. If NASA builds a rocket and puts this up, like, it costs millions and billions of dollars, and they achieved it much cheaper and much more efficient. The next one, if we go deeper into cultural embeddedness, is master narratives. And for me, one of the most amazing concepts that I learned about. It's deeply embedded narratives. They are so deeply embedded that often we don't even know that we have them. So one part of them is their invisibility. And for space travel, we could list 3 here. One is the human drive to survive, because we all know at some point there might be an asteroid or sun will explode. We actually know that very far in the future, not to worry you. But if humanity manages to leave Earth to somewhere else, we will make sure humanity survives, right? So that's a very deep narrative we have. All of us want to see the next day, next month, and so on. Redemption from failure to success. Space travel is a lot about that. It's very dangerous, a lot of exploding rockets. You can talk a lot about how you failed and how you got things right afterwards. And exploration, because humans want to know what's behind the corner, what's behind the horizon. And space travel is a big thing about exploration. Local narratives, that's just things that fewer people know. In terms of employee communications, you can think about this. If you have 10 locations worldwide, there will be specific narratives that are only existing at your specific locations because it's issues or discussions there. For space travel, we could think about there are some regions in the US, for instance, California and Florida, where all these space companies are located. They create fantastic jobs, high-paying jobs, and they also create an industrial ecosystem there. So that could be a local narrative. And the last one is local identity. That's the things that are deeply embedded into our culture and our personal identities. And it could be very different things to talk about. For space travel, you could say, because it's a fast-paced environment, because it's very interesting, technically highly challenging, if you think about talent that they want to recruit the best people in the world, and they want to recruit highly ambitious people. So that's about the identity aspect. So now we have a narrative map, and it's obviously a very simplified one. But what we can do now is to say, for Blue Origin and for the benefit of Earth, we can check how they fit to the narrative map. And we can say, for their vision, are they achieving positive connections, neutral connections, or negative connections with this narrative map? And a simplified narrative map for Blue Origin would look like this. They have a few positive connections, they have a few neutral ones, and they have specifically the negative one because more or less 100% of their current business is done with space tourists, right? So if you look to their website, they talk a lot about the stories and the emotional things of space tourists, but unfortunately, most of the space tourists are millionaires So the stories are not so much like touching for all of us because they are very far away from what normal people look like. And the other thing is, if you look at the master narratives, they don't connect to the master narratives for a couple of reasons. So the human drive to survive, they look at Earth, they don't look outside. Redemption, because they do space tourism, they are not talking about their failure. It's like an airline. They need to talk about safety all the time. They had a rocket that was exploding. And this rocket, and while it exploded, they actually had a successful test of a safety system. So it was a success. But it's nowhere on their website. It's nowhere on their YouTube channel. They are not talking about that, right? And exploration, yeah, as they look back on Earth and not to space, it's not too much resonating. If you look to SpaceX, different. And the interesting thing here specifically is SpaceX much better resonates overall with the narrative map, but specifically also with the master narratives that we want to go to. And that's why, from my personal opinion, the SpaceX vision is also way more powerful and engaging because it fits much better into this narrative map. And from my personal opinion, if I would have to change or to discuss the vision of Blue Origin, I would actually try to make this much more resonating with the narrative map. For instance, with Explore Space to Protect Earth, it's much stronger. And I think also it connects better to what they are actually doing. NASA has given them an order to create a moon landing device. So they are starting to explore space much more, and they should change their messaging. What does it do for technology? I think the most interesting insight, and we started off and I didn't even think about that. The moment we have narrative maps, that's the moment we can also describe our audience to an AI system. We can talk about our audience. We can talk about context. And what you can already see, if you create a message, and as a context before you create the message, you give to the AI, here's the narratives, the key narratives that my audience has, then AI is able to predict how the audience will react to the message. It's able to flag potential problems, right? And it's able to make suggestions that specifically go down to this group. And if you have a global company with a lot of locations and different cultures, it's amazingly helpful with AI understanding all these different groups and helping you to localize your message. And so narratives maps are not just a decision tool for comms, they're also a tool to provide amazing context to AI. 3 quick ideas about transforming communications with the power of narratives. And I think one of the very foundational ones is about how you create a strategy in communications. And we see that also a lot of our customers and a lot of communicators, they are in a position of being like a service center or service department in your organizations. So they get the requests from the departments to say, here's my story, tell my story, can you pretty this up, right? We have this event, can you help me this? So they get a lot of operational requests from this side, which doesn't help with being really strategic about what you're doing. And the key idea is to say, starting from the other side and say, what's the reputation, the long-term reputation we want to build? What are the key narratives that we want our audience to know and to build? And a narrative is multiple years to build this up. So it's a multiple year strategy that over time you can do a lot of like sub-narratives and build a logic here. But the whole idea is to say, the more you come from this side, the more you can say no to these stories, and the more you can say, that's the narratives we want to build, and I pick and select the stories that I need for that. Second one, what you will find, and we live in very polarized times where we have a lot of issues where people start screaming at each other, and it seems like people don't even listen to each other anymore. And the interesting thing, if you understand the narrative map of your audience, you can actually go there and say, can we find common ground? And the interesting thing is specifically in the more deeply embedded ones, there's a high likelihood that you find common ground, right? We all have the same values about family. We all want to be safe. We want our family to grow up. We want prosperity. We want hard work to be rewarded. So a lot of these insights and values, if you find them here, you can start with them and go then to the more controversial sides of things. And that's an amazing tool that you can use. And by the way, I've had I wanted to say love-hate, but it's actually a hate relationship with personas. I've been an intranet consultant for 10 years and then communications consultant and 10 years ago founding Staffbase. Not sure what you think about personas. I've seen this as a tool that a lot of energy goes in the beginning and a lot of hard discussions if Mary has a cat or a dog and all these things. But throughout the project, it really doesn't help a lot in the long term unless you do it in a really structured way. After working with this now for over a year, this is a way more useful tool to think about your audience, and it's specifically also a decision-making tool to decide what are the messages, what is the messaging strategy that we want to use to bring this audience from A to B to change hearts and minds. So I think that's a very useful tool that we will try to also do more research about, do more workshops about, and make this available to the community. And last one, and I want to come back to Joanna's post and about the frustration and about how can you involve stakeholders where you feel they are not aware of the challenge of communications. And the great thing about narratives is it gives you a tool to talk about this. What I've done in a workshop is take the narrative map and discuss it with leaders. And it's so amazing because they start to understand that this is what their audience has in their mind. And whatever they say needs to resonate with that. So alone having a narrative map, giving it to leaders, discussing it with them is a great way to have more understanding. And also, it's a much better way to go from, here's the message you have to say, don't ask me why, just say it, to here's the narrative we want to build, and you can be part of it to do that. And my last point is the point I wanted to make about why I think it's the future of communications. This is, not sure who here knows Bill Quirky. I think he's written the best book about employee, still the best book about employee comms, Making the Connections. I can highly recommend this. Incredibly smart book. And he's written about the roles of comms and how they evolve from a distributor, craftsman, all up to consultant and coach. And I think the future of communications, we all, and I see a lot of also young faces here, all you, in your careers, you want to go, and by the way, he says, if you want to be a coach, you need to be this first, right? It's not good or bad. But if you want to go this way, all this way up, if you want to be a consultant, a coach, what I'm saying, a lot of what we talked about with narratives, messaging, understanding, structural understanding of your audience and what resonates with them really resonates very well with this career. So the better you understand narratives, the more powerful and impactful communicators can become. And I think that's why I believe it's the future of communications. Thank you very much.